It does things that I don't know today,
For sure.
and I'm a lot older.
Okay.
On fusion, we work the other way. You take little atoms like hydrogen, tritium, this kind of thing, and you put them together under the right condition in a plasma, which is a very hot environment, and that's the same thing that takes place in the sun. The sun doesn't have to create its plasma; it's already there. And little hydrogen atoms bind together and build up. And for some reason, instead of, you would think that with the heavy isotopes, heavy atoms splitting, you release some masses, I told you, and form energy.
Right.
Well, surprise, surprise, when you put the little ones together, you also lose some energy. It doesn't go gain. You lose some, in other words, you lose as you go from either end of the atomic table toward the center. You lose a little bit of mass and gain energy. Tiny little fractions of the mass converts into energy. That's true at the high end, and it's true at the low end. So as you move toward the center, you don't always get to the center. But as you move the hydrogen fusion toward the center, toward heavier molecules or atoms than hydrogen, then you gain. You gain energy. Lose a little mass, gain a little energy. And of course, putting it together is a lot of energy.
Right.
So you got to drive the hydrogen in the plasma. Well, from an atomic bomb point of view, that gave you another step in severity, because if you use the atomic bomb to generate a hydrogen bomb, then you're going up by factors of many, 100,000, whatever the limit, practically no decent limit. The hydrogen bombs that we can produce today are very many times more powerful than the original A-bomb. And but on the other hand, it does require some additional money. For the bomb, not very much. I mean, it won't kill you to go from A-bomb to H-bomb. In energy-producing reactors, if you're talking about fission energy and fusion energy to make power, to make energy, not bombs, then you're really talking about a new level of technology. And it's not as simple as I was. The principle is still simple, but doing it becomes a major undertaking. And we frankly don't know how to do it today, although we seem to be moving closer to the feasibility. It's not feasible today. Nobody knows how to carry out a fusion reaction slow enough so it doesn't become a bomb but produces energy. It's still a dream today. Now, some people think we're fairly close. Other people say, that's what you told us 50 years ago. We're about as close today as we were 50 years ago. So you have pessimists and optimists.
Absolutely.
But fusion energy does not exist, is the honest way to say it. If it did exist, it would work like I told you. But nobody knows how to run that plasma practically and produce fusion in a commercial, acceptable way today. So it's a dream. There's only fission. You can spike the fission with a little bit of light atoms added to the fission, but really it's fission. As far as nuclear reactors are concerned, there are no nuclear fusion reactors. There are only fusion bombs, and they get generated by fission bombs. So it's the picture's a little different whether you're talking about energy producing or whether you're talking about bombs.
Right.
Bombs we know we've produced. energy-producing reactors, fusion reactors, are still a dream. And they may not be so cheap. You know, you may get there and find out that it's commercially not all that attractive, because we really don't know where we're missing exactly and what we will have to do in order to get there practically.
Right.
And if you pour more energy into it than you get out, there's no big deal. I mean,
Exactly.
who would like to have a fusion reactor where you have to put energy in instead of getting energy out? Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And nobody can tell you that we know how to get more energy out today in mass scale. And then when you add to that economically acceptable, you're putting another layer of requirements on it.
Right.
There's no big deal if it produces even more energy than you put in if it's very expensive. And if it's more expensive than wind energy or solar energy or whatever, biomass like wood and trees energy, then what's the big deal?
Right.
It's a competitive game.
Oh, indeed. There's
So
much.
we're quite a distance away from a practical fusion reactor for energy producing purposes.
Right. Let's look at the Cold War era and what was the work that was done at the facility after the Manhattan Project and during the Cold War era.
From my point of view, I'm not sure I know what you're asking. We're now in the Cold War era, and
From
what?
Like 48 to 64 in that time frame.
What happened technically or politically
what
or what?
kind of work was being done there at the facility? And
Well, I left, of course, in '57, although I know what went on, and I came back in '67. So there was a 10-year period when I was up in New York
right.
working in corporate staff and stuff like that. Oak Ridge, in those days, made plant improvements. You know, they learned how to maybe pass the gas in more efficient ways, and those improvements were made in those days. Now, unfortunately, centrifuges competed with, not our centrifuges, but centrifuges made by Urenco and other people, competed and were able to go lower than our government-imposed price, which I said earlier. We were too dumb to, and that was dumb, not ignorant. We were too dumb to realize that when you got competition, you don't want to hold the price umbrella over them.
Right.
So we screwed up, and eventually they threatened to put us out of business. We're hanging on by our teeth today to still be producing fuel for reactors. And most people will tell you that if you're going to build additional plants, they're likely to be built of centrifuges and not gas diffusion. And that I think we could have avoided. In one of two ways, either drop the price and at least postpone the centrifuge, the new centrifuge plants, because they wouldn't pay off if you lowered the price, or if that was inefficient, not adequate, and they still were threatening, then we could have gone into centrifuges and built competitive centrifuges, which we did not do. Now, whose fault was it that we didn't? That other people could outperform us? Now, remember, we outperformed them in the early days with gas diffusion and K-25s and all that stuff. We were tops. Nobody could compete with us. The picture reversed when the outsiders came in with little centrifuges that they didn't care how long. Well, that's not the way to say it. They were willing to use little centrifuges and consider them expendable. If you lost one little centrifuge, who cares? And they designed the plant to live with a bunch of dead centrifuges and not do maintenance until you're ready to do maintenance. Now, that's not our technology. That's the competitive technology, Urenco things. And they were able to put a plan together that that beat our technology. And we were going to bigger and bigger centrifuges, gigantic. I mean, one of our centrifuges could take care of not millions, but a lot of their little centrifuges. But what good is it if it's too expensive to build the big centrifuge and operate it when the other guy was willing to operate with a bunch of dead little centrifuges because he had enough life left to justify continuing operation? Then when he shut it down, he took all the little dead centrifuges and replaced them. So, much as I regret to say so, as dominant as we were in the early days, we lost that dominance in terms of competitiveness under the government in the later years, and including today. If we wanted to be competitive in the centrifuge business, we would have to do it either some brand new way that nobody has invented yet, but could work toward with big centrifuges, or go to the small, go to the design philosophy that our competitors followed very successfully. So we're no longer recognized the world over as the leaders in isotope separation, specifically uranium isotope separation. Now, a lot of people don't like to hear that, but that's the truth. I think it'll do us some good. It ought to do us some good to realize that you win a few and you lose a few, and learn from their losses. Don't deny it. Right. So, in overall answer to your question, both our management under the government, our business management, our technical management, suffered in competition with Urenco and other people that took a different path. So they outperformed us. We were losers. Now, I guess I don't have personally as much at stake because in those days I was up in New York. It's those other guys that lost it.
What are your thoughts about how the activities accomplished revolutionized the world?
Well, the United States is sitting comfortably with one heck of a lot of coal. If the Middle East is overflowing with oil resources, we're overflowing with coal resources in the United States. And the problem with coal is, it's okay, it can be done cheaply, but it is messy, and it screws up the environment. So then we put a lot of money into scrubbers and all kinds of absorbers so that we take out the stuff that we don't want to put out in the stack, including mercury and all kinds of sulfur components and nitrogen, and warm up the global warming and all that stuff. That comes very heavily with coal. So now it depends how much money do you want to spend for clean air and clean water and all that stuff. And when you take that into account, then coal becomes more expensive, and nuclear could compete with clean coal. So compete, but not overwhelm it completely. It's not like you can improve by a factor of 10 or anything like that. And the way we build nuclear plants under the government, with a lot of help from extremists on the environmental side, the way we build those is very inefficient. And whereas it ought to take us about 3 years to build a nuclear plant, it started to take us 13 years to build a nuclear plant. But when you're spending a lot of capital, money, and you don't get any product out of it, it's just sitting there going through a bunch of bureaucratic somersaults with a bunch of environmentalists and judges making decisions when they don't know what they're talking about. And they're both. They're dumb and ignorant. Forgive me. But when you're facing a situation like that, then the nation is suffering some economic damage that it shouldn't have to damage, because there's no excuse for a nuclear plant taking 13 years to be built. It doesn't make it any safer. In fact, you can argue it makes it less safe, because some of the parts are 13 years old and some of the parts are brand new, and you're slapping them all together at the last point and build and put the plant in operation. A lot of times, the equivalent of rust sets in to the early stuff before you can ever operate it.
Right.
So the way we went about authorizing nuclear plants was very silly, and we're still suffering from that. And besides that, we're not educating people properly on nuclear energy and oil and coal and all that stuff. Now, the oil situation is that the Middle East is lucky enough to sit on oil. Now, they formed a cartel. That's illegal in the United States. Mm-hmm. But internationally, they didn't have anything. So what could we have done, or what could we do tomorrow? We could say, okay, if you're going to form a cartel, this is I'm going to be mean. It's a mean counter strategy. If you guys are going to charge us by forming a cartel and keeping prices of what costs you practically nothing to get it out of the ground, it almost produces itself, and you're going to charge us a fortune for it, which you are today, I'll tell you what we'll do, what we'll threaten to do. We'll form a food cartel, and we'll prevent you from eating. We'll threaten to prevent you from eating, because you don't have enough food in much of the oil-producing world. You got a lot of oil and you got a lot of sand. Okay, so we can make a list of the things that you need, and we're going to form a cartel. And we'll peg the price of what we're going to charge you, not just the United States, but Argentina produces a lot of meat. We'd have to get together with a lot of countries and form a mean strategy. We don't even discuss this. You haven't seen anything about it in the papers. It's probably new to you. The thought is probably new to you.
Right.
But it's a hard-nosed way of dealing with it, and you would force the oil producers to come to grips with what's good for the goose, good for the gander, and they'd have to be more reasonable. The counterpoint to that strategy, the mean strategy, is that you're dealing with countries that really, as I said, have nothing but oil and sand. And if you force them to get rid of their oil at low prices by this mean strategy, you're really creating a very dangerous future for them, because what are they going to do after the oil runs out? And it's going to run out in decades, not in centuries. We don't know exactly how many decades, but it ain't centuries.
No.
So we know that after they sell all their oil, they'll have to start selling sand, and nobody wants to buy sand. See? So that they are facing nationally, from their point of view, a grim future. We don't discuss any of that stuff because there ain't too many people that know about it, and they can't talk well, and they can't teach well, and the population is lost, and the media are lost. If I gave this talk to a media person, you're at least patient enough to listen. If I talk to a media person like that, the first thought they'd have is that this guy's crazy. Why, if he's right, why haven't we heard all this before? See, but that's the situation. So when you talk about energy strategy, it's complex, and you have to decide, which way's up. What are you trying to achieve? So if I think selfishly for our side, I come up with a mean strategy. If I want to be fair to the other person and take their interests into account, then I have to compromise and not rely on the mean strategy.
Sure.
And so that forces you to determine who you are and which way is up. And that's an area of public policy that very few people can navigate in.
Right. It's one that's not getting navigated in.
So I'm answering your question in a fundamental way. But you need to know that if you're really going to do energy planning,
right,
you need to know what the truth is. And then you can proceed to come up with some practical options. And it's always options. It's not just, I don't know of any major decision that just has one solution. There are always options. So you're comparing options with uncertainties in the future, and you do the best you can to pick the strategy that you think maximizes your chances of success. Don't guarantee it, but it seems to be better than these other options. So decision making in a serious way amounts to selecting choices among options.
Absolutely.
And most politicians are not very good at it.
Let's go back to your actual job and what you did at the facility.
Well, it varied. When I was up in New York, I did research on the separation medium itself. And when I came to Oak Ridge, I taught in the wheat school, as I told you, for a few weeks, and told people how gas diffusion works and what you had, how you had to operate it, and what kind of contingencies you were facing. Things could go wrong, and what were you going to do if it does go wrong? What options do you have for putting it back in control if it goes out of control, and so forth. Then I got into really production, development, design, all of those. And as I said, the only thing we didn't have was sales in those early days because there was no need for it. The person that sponsored us, the group that sponsored us was the government. And they knew darn well that they wanted the product. They wanted the ingredients for the bombs. So there was no selling involved. There was just producing it involved.
And what did you specifically do after you taught at the wheat school?
I supervised groups of operators in the plant. I told you about the story of the girls and making sure you spend enough time with each group. And so I did that for a while. And then George Feldback, who was a vice president of Union Carbide, came down and he looked us, he eyeballed us and said, "You guys are acting too smug. Yes, you made this plant successful and you're operating it. Don't tell me if you had to do it again that you'd build it the same way. Why don't you form a group that pretends that somebody's just asked you to build that plant all over again? How would you do it today with what you know?" And I headed that group. So he asked by what most people thought at that time was a very crazy theoretical question. Well, as it turned out, they wanted more plant. And so the inventions that I made in those early days were needed. They were used. They weren't just put away, filed away. They were used. They were used in the new plants. The early plants were designed by Kellogg's, which was a sub-company of Kellogg. The later plants were designed by Union Carbide, And the Union Carbide design plans took advantage of the inventions that I made and that other people made. And I've already told you about those.
Right.
So I headed that design group. Then when Y12 had a problem of separation, we worked with them too. And we weren't very popular with Y12 in the early days because we put them out of business.
Mm-hmm.
S50, the same thing. Have you heard of S50? Thermal diffusion?
Mm-mm.
Well, it existed. At one time, thermal diffusion was supposed to be the successful diffusion process until gas diffusion put them out of business. So there was a S50 thermal diffusion plant. This is not classified. Not far from the power plant location. That was supposed to be enlarged. It was never enlarged because we could do with our little finger what they were doing in a very expensive plant. So the process disappeared. Then we also put Y12 gradually out of business, and I remember Clarence Larson, who was in charge of the Y12 plant in those days, and he came over with his assistants, and he says, "We just improved the Y12 process. We're going to put you out of business." Well, in the meantime, K-25 was improving also, and I told you we reduced staff enormously. All those extra girls and operators weren't needed. So we reduced our cost down to practically power, the energy we used to circulate the pumps and stuff. And then we had the more efficient designs that I just also told you about. So we put eventually for a while there, Y12 was hoping that we would do the early separation from feed concentration up, and then they would take over and do the final. But they weren't even competing in the final step. So eventually, the Cayetans were put out of business, which meant Y12 was put out of business. So then Johnny Murray and people at Y12 converted the plant to a weapons plant, and Y12 got in a weapons business instead of isotope separation. And that gave them a new lease of life, but they were no longer competing with us because we weren't making any weapons in K-25 and they weren't separating any isotopes at Y-12. So they shifted into a different kind of business, which they're still in today. But it is an isotope separation. So that's where I worked the latter part of my Oak Ridge years, is basically putting Y-12 out of business and making gas diffusion successful. Don't tell that to the Y-12 people.